Well, wonderful to see everybody. I'm Jim Goldgeier, Dean of the School of International Service, and it's such a great pleasure to welcome you to this event on World War I and Russia. We've been talking for quite some time about doing an event on World War I, and thrilled that we waited until we got exactly the right person for such an event. So I'm just thrilled that Dominic Levin is here to be with us for this event, and our moderator, Eric Lohr, professor of history over in the College of Arts and Sciences. And I do want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences, the Department of History, and the AU Initiative for Russian Culture for co-sponsoring this event. Just absolutely delighted to have their support. I am here simply to just give a couple brief introductions of our guest and our moderator, and then I will turn everything over to Eric to go on from there. Just also want to mention before I introduce the two of them that I know we have a number of people who've come because of the mailing list from the Initiative for Russian Culture. If you are interested in SIS events, please visit the SIS homepage, and you can see how to sign up for our newsletter and our events bulletin, and we would love to see you here for future events. So Dominic Levin is an author and historian, authority on World War I, as well as a whole range of other issues with respect to Russian history, European history. He's currently a senior research fellow at Trinity College in Cambridge, research professor at Cambridge University, and a fellow of the British Academy. He previously taught at the London School of Economics. His most recent book, Russia Against Napoleon, was a huge critical success, and he's now currently completing a book on Russia and World War I that will be released later this year, I believe. So excited to see that. As I mentioned, Eric Lohr here at American University is professor and Susan Carmel Lehrman Chair of Russian History and Culture at CAS. Most importantly, he's an affiliated faculty member of the School of International Service. He has written two major books dealing with nationality, identity, and citizenship issues in Russia. And he, too, is writing a book on Russia and World War I. So it will be great to have both of these books out as part of the literature on World War I, which for those of you who have not delved into the World War I literature, it is voluminous, but who could ask for anything more than to have contributions from these two gentlemen on this important subject. So without further ado, Eric and Dominic, I turn things over to you. Dominic's going to come up and speak, and then you're going to do the conversation. Great. So I turn over to Dominic. Welcome to American University. Great to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for all turning out on a cold day. It's great to be back. Good. I mean, what I'm going to talk about is my book, which is about to come out actually about 3 months from now in England, in August here. The book is about 5% an international history of the Russian Revolution, particularly its origins. It's about 60% a history of Russia's path into the First World War. And if my mathematics is right, that makes it about 35% about the international context, international comparisons. In other words, about the crisis which plunged the world into the war in 14, and to some extent about its consequences. So I will talk briefly in that order. Firstly, very briefly indeed, about international history of the revolution. At one level, this comes down to the issue of foreign intervention. And at its most basic, it comes down to one point, that if the old regime had collapsed in peacetime, which it very nearly did in the winter of 1905-6, and if Russia had then gone far to the left, as it almost certainly would in the event of the Tsarist regime collapsing, then it seems to me that foreign intervention would have been inevitable, decisive, far more effective than it actually was after the First World War. Certainly the idea that the European great powers in peacetime would stand aside while Russia dropped out of the international system, of which it was a very important part. On top of that, set itself up as the headquarters of international socialist revolution and repudiated the then equivalent of trillions of dollars of foreign debt. And this was inevitable in any Russian revolution, saw the expropriation and in some cases the murder of the German elites of the Baltic provinces. The idea that you would not have had a very formidable European intervention spearheaded by the German army is, I think, moonshine. Of course, what actually happens because of the war is that intervention in one sense is much less effective, and in another sense, the more decisive one, is actually on the side of revolution. Because by far the most important country in any joint European intervention in Russia would have to be Germany. As a neighbour, as the most formidable military power in Europe, and as the only European power with a substantial German ethnic community in Russia. In peacetime, Germany would have spearheaded foreign intervention. In the First World War, it puts all its efforts into intervening in Russia in order to spur the revolution forward. And that, I think, is by no means the most important element in what happens in Russia, but certainly to my mind one of the 3 or 4 most important elements. The point is that by the time foreign intervention comes, Allied intervention in 1919 really, in the first place the English and French are pretty pathetic in comparison to what peacetime Germany would have been. And in any case by then you've given the Bolshevik regime that crucial year in which to consolidate its hold over the geopolitical centre of the Russian Empire, and that is crucial in the Civil War. All right. That is more or less all I'm going to say about the international context of the Russian Revolution. A much larger part of the book is about Russia's path into the First World War. Now it seems to me that Russian pre-war foreign policy really is determined by 3 factors. The first is security. The second is Russian interests as perceived by the monarchy's leadership. And the third is identity. And I'll take them in turn. Security above all means fear of German hegemony in Europe. The Franco-Russian alliance is essentially created and then sustained, supported by the Russian government because of the belief that Germany is the most powerful state on the continent, and the only way to secure Russian interests is to have a powerful ally in France. Otherwise you're going to get steamrollered. And if that was already true in the 1890s, it is of course more true after the debacle of 1945. Fundamentally, this is a balance of power strategy. Now, as we all know, balance of power strategies have their problems. In the first place, it is often difficult accurately to analyze the elements of power between states. It's a complicated matter. It virtually always requires an analysis of an even more complicated matter, which is not just states' power, but the intentions and aspirations of their leaders. It was particularly complicated in pre-war Europe because if you were thinking about who was the potential hegemon of Europe today, your answer would almost certainly be Germany. If you were asking who was the potential hegemon of Europe tomorrow, meaning in 5 or possibly 10 years' time, then your answer might be Russia. In any event, there's an additional complication. We are operating in what you might describe as the first era of Anglophone liberal globalization. And the incessant chatter, for instance, in Germany about world policy reflects that fact. So is one talking about the balance of power in Europe or the global balance of power? I'll just sum up this little section by saying that in the first place, all of these issues press hard on the Russian leadership and are debated within it. But the Russian leadership is anything but unique. Exactly the same debates and exactly the same problems exist in London, for instance, when you are contemplating the international situation before 14. Second point was interests. Well, Russia has many interests. One of the problems of the Russian Empire before 1914 is that it has key interests to defend globally and does not have the resources adequately to defend them in all areas of the globe. But the most important interests, as the leadership saw it, were the Straits. In other words, the waterway leading from the Black Sea through to the Mediterranean, with the Bosphorus at the Black Sea and the Dardanelles at the Mediterranean end, and the city of Constantinople rather inconveniently in between. There has been quite a bit of literature, English language literature, above all by Ron Bobroff and Sean McMeekin in the last few years, which has tended to stress that Russian ambitions at the Straits were a destabilizing factor in European international relations before the First World War, and they're right. The only thing I think you need to say, or to remember, is that, of course, Russia's ambitions at the Straits were hardly unique. You cannot, make judgments about Russian policy vis-à-vis the Straits unless you take into account the fact that the British have pinched the Suez Canal, in the process taking over the whole of Egypt, one of the greatest historical centers of Islam, and the Americans have coolly run off with the Panama Canal, more or less fomenting a revolution in Colombia and then pinching the canal as a result. Now, the Straits matter a good deal more to Russia than the Suez Canal does to Britain or that Panama does to America, for the very simple reason that there is no other option. All Russian trade, from the biggest exporting area, the core of the Russian economy before 1914, which is southern Ukraine, new Russia, has to go through the Straits. There is no alternative. So does the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So whereas the British, in the last resort, can send their warships and their trade round the Cape, and whereas the Americans, of course, have two enormous coastlines on the world's great oceans, Russia's stuck. I think one would need to add, however, at least it's my view, that although the Straits clearly were immensely important for Russia, they nevertheless were given an exaggerated, not significance as such, but the idea that pinching the Straits and getting access to the Mediterranean was going to solve your problems was actually, and unfortunately, not true, for the very simple reason that the Straits lead into a closed sea. And it was, after all, Mussolini who wrote that unless Italy could secure one of the two exits from the Mediterranean, either at Gibraltar or at Suez, it would not be a serious great power. In other words, if the great dream of some of the key devisers of Russian policy had come true, if they'd got the Straits, they would have solved about 20% of their problems. And that does illustrate rather neatly that when you are talking about global international relations, Russia is in many senses weakly placed in comparison to the British and the Americans. Thirdly, identity. Well, most obviously that means various forms of Slavophilism, to slightly misuse a term. The basic idea that Russia is a Slav country is, by its very essence, its identity, destined to be the leader, liberator, protector of the Slav peoples of the world. Now, of course, there are many unique aspects of the various strains of Slavophile thinking and action in Russia. But again, you do not need to exaggerate the extent to which Russia is exotic. In other words, you do not need to take the line taken either by Russia's greatest enemies or its greatest friends, that this is somehow something unique. Actually, already pre-1914 and with increasing strength in the 20th century thereafter, the great struggle is between three blocks, which you could describe as not just geopolitical but also ethno-ideological. That is the Anglo-Americans and the Germans in Central Europe, and then the Russians and whoever they can gather around them. You look at the Anglo-American alliance, one reason why it proved so strong and still exists is that it was always founded in a great deal more than pure common geopolitical interest. ethno-ideological solidarity is crucial. The same is even more so the case if you think of Germany and Austria, which of course before 1914 is a much tighter, formal, geopolitical, military alliance than was the case with the British and the Americans until during the Second World War. So Russia is not unique. Slavophilism, the various strains of Pan-Slavism, can, I think, and should be seen within a comparative global context. Again, however, what stands out is the relative weakness of Russia. The basic problem is that the Slavs are not divided. The two largest Slav countries, the Russians and the Poles, are at each other's throats. Even the Orthodox Slav community has that great enmity, or I was about to be cynical and say that great love between the Serbs and the Bulgarians. Beyond that, among the great strengths of the Anglo-American and the Germanic bloc is that in both cases it is very possible, indeed it's legitimate, to think that one is talking about states at the very forefront of economic progress and, as they would see things anyway, of world civilization. Nobody before 1914 abroad sees Tsarist Russia, either in terms of its economic development or the nature of its political regime, as being in the forefront of anything. And then, of course, there's the more basic point, that even if the Slavs really had been united, as some of the Slavophiles dreamt, they would still have been a great deal less powerful than the Germanic bloc in Central Europe at that time, let alone, of course, far less powerful than the potentially vast combined resources of the British Empire and the United States. I would say that Slavophilism is, to varying degrees of heat and in slightly different variations, very widespread within the Russian elites before 14, but it isn't universal. What is near universal as a point of identity among those elites is the idea that Russia is, was, and always must be a great power, which for reasons I'll explain in a minute is more or less coterminous with saying is, was, and always must be a great empire. I mean, if you read what the leaders say, and even more read between the lines of what they say, that above all, for that Tsarist elite, particularly, of course, the diplomatic and military elite, goes to the very core of their conception of Russian identity. During the Second Moroccan crisis, for instance, Alexander Izvolsky, the former foreign minister, now ambassador in Paris, writes to Stolypin, dreading the possibility that an obscure conflict over Morocco might draw Russia into what could easily be a fatal conflict. But he says, we cannot drop out of the European system. We cannot be just Germany's loyal lieutenant. That would be to betray the Russia of Peter the Great and of Catherine II. In a sense, what he means is that would be to betray me and the Russia with which I identify. And the whole elite identifies in that sense. So in one sense, this is Russia as empire, Russia's whole identity, wrapped up in the idea of empire. And that takes me on to the last third of my book, really, the broader international context, the comparisons. Again, at the risk of vast generalization, it seems to me that more than anything else, the First World War is a war about empire. Empire has an enormous hold on the ruling elites of Europe before 1914 for all sorts of reasons. It is, among other things, seen as the mark of a people's place in history, but also of its virility, of its whole genius. What I'll concentrate on, though, here is just the geopolitical aspects of empire. In the first place, part of the obsession with empire is to do with the fact that a number of great powers are now in the race, whereas for much of the 19th century the British have more or less had things their own way. Therefore there is increasing paranoia to, as the Earl of Rosebery, a former British Prime Minister, put it, peg out your stakes for the future. You never know what's going to be under the ground given the development of technology. The last thing you want is for someone else to pinch key resources and not let you in. And you can see a sort of logic of the Boer War in that sense. The British War in South Africa, 1899 to 1902. The British let the Boer farmers float off into the African interior quite cheerfully in the 1870s and 80s, until it turns out that actually this godforsaken bit of the African interior is the world's richest treasure trove of gold and minerals, diamonds. And at that point, the British fight an extremely bloody and expensive war to force the Boers back in. You never know, given technology, is the point. And technology is important too in another sense, and this is to take you back to Mackinder and his idea that the whole geopolitical basis of global power is shifting from domination by sea powers to domination by great continental land empires. That's the railway more than anything else. The railway provides the opportunity to penetrate, colonize and exploit the heartlands of continents. But above all else, I think the geopolitical logic of empire, as perceived by European leaderships, is to do with the United States. Once the United States has survived the Civil War and has then had 3-4 decades of breakneck economic development, it is absolutely clear to anyone but the entirely dumb that it is going to be a superpower in the 20th century on a scale that no European power can match, unless you have an empire. Only continental scale great powers will be true powers vis-à-vis the United States in the 20th century. That is the fundamental geopolitical logic of empire. And it is the fundamental logic, to my mind, more than any other, underpinning the age of high imperialism. But there's a contradiction, because at the same time as the dominant logic of international relations and international power points to empire, the dominant logic of domestic politics points to ethnic nationalism, which is generally regarded by elites at that time as the most effective way to consolidate a community and to legitimize its rulers in the eyes of that community. You find me a polity of continental scale, which is not multinational. So there's a problem. It's a problem which is still with us. Why do we talk about the United States, China, and potentially India now? Well, they are of continental scale. What about the European Union, which is an attempt to ensure that Europe is not marginalized on the big issues by pooling its resources? And its big problem is legitimacy, because nationalism was invented in Europe, and as you may have noticed, is still rather powerful. Look, I'm aware that this kind of line is not fashionable. Historians are very disinclined now to subscribe to national and nationalist narratives. Empire is regarded as a good deal tougher than the nationalist narratives traditionally argued. I agree with all of that. I mean, all my natural sympathies are on the side of empire, not the nation. And I accept the fact that even the more ramshackle empires, the Ottoman one for a start, not to mention the Austrian, put up a pretty good fight in the First World War. Beyond that, the great states of Asia, where I live half my life, India, Indonesia, Iran, Persia, even China to some extent, if they get European ethno-nationalist disease, God help us all, the planet mightn't survive. And yet, you cannot take the power of ethnic nationalism out of 20th century history or out of pre-1914 international politics. As much as anything else, it was powerful, but also the elites really, really believed it was powerful, felt that it was the only way, probably, to guarantee the survival and the power of a major polity into the 20th century. Now, it seems to me that, specifically the First World War begins because of the crisis and the conflicts of empires and nationalisms in East Central and Southeastern Europe. The decline and seeming fall of the Ottoman Empire, the most obvious point, after all, that is the Macedonian issue, that's the Bosnian issue. It's the great fears that Constantinople itself may soon be on the agenda, and the Austrian fear that they're going the same way. I mean, 1914, the decision for war is, to my mind, an Austrian preemptive strike. It is an attempt to turn Serbia back into the kind of protectorate which it had been informally for most of the 19th century. and it is an attempt to reassert the monarchy's power and vitality in the face of both external and internal enemies. To my mind, though, it seems again essential to put this in international context. In wishing to turn a pesky neighbour, let alone a pesky neighbour which very obviously had designs on your own territory, into some kind of protectorate, the desire to discipline it, show it the full fury of your imperial power, the Austrians were, after all, acting exactly like imperial powers the world over. The Austrian elites looked on Serbia as Germans at the top of the ladder of civilization, on what they saw as more backward, primitive Slavs, aristocrats, as they usually were, looking at what they wrongly by now perceived to be peasants, or one generation jumped up middle-class ex-peasants. Also very much, of course, with a view of a great power towards a non-great power at a time when great power really meant something in terms of formal status in international relations. And then particularly, of course, after the regicide in 1903, which brings the Karađorđević dynasty back in Serbia, as bastions of civilization faced by barbarism. Well, that, roughly speaking, sums up the general view of European imperialism vis-à-vis the lesser races. Austrian civilizing mission in Bosnia, very similar to various areas of the British Empire and other empires. The great problem, though, is that playing the game of empire is much, much simpler outside Europe than within it. Partly for obvious geopolitical reasons. The whole of Europe grinds its teeth when the British squash the Boers. There's not much you can do about it given British naval power. But on the continent of Europe, you have large exposed land frontiers, and other great powers can do something pretty nasty about it. But it's not just geopolitics. However much they may be rivals outside Europe, the European great powers are united in their firm sense of civilizational superiority, to put things politely, and they can all, in a way, gang up on squashing the native. The trouble about the next-door neighbour native of the Austrians is that they're Slavs, and German cultural arrogance vis-à-vis the Slavs is likely to touch what you might describe as tender nerves in Russia. There are, after all, no black great powers to be offended in 1914, but there is a great Slav power. So it seems to me that, one does need to put things in perspective. One needs to remember, too, that at precisely the same moment that the struggle between empire and nationalism is bringing on catastrophic conflict in East Central Europe, it is, after all, paralysing British domestic politics. This is the Irish issue. And it seems to me that actually, if you stand back a bit, if you want to find parallels with 1914, it seems to me that the Suez Crisis in 1956 is the 1914 moment of the British and French empires. These are imperial elites increasingly desperate, faced by geopolitical decline and nationalist challenges, and they combine, in a very 1914 Austrian way, desperation, arrogance, and miscalculation. The big difference is that Big Brother in Washington says no, and Big Brother in Berlin in 14 says go ahead, for its own reasons. So, and this is the concluding bit, as you will gather from that, it seems to me that as regards July-August 1914 itself, the Germans and Austrians bear the overwhelming responsibility for bringing on the war. Ironically, though, it seems to me that though the Germans in particular bear a huge responsibility for starting the war, it may be very unfortunate for the world that they didn't win it. They did actually come close in the winter of 1916-17. It seems to me that if the Germans had not brought the Americans into the war on the very eve of the Russian Revolution taking the Russians out, they would have won the First World War. At least they should have done. You didn't need to defeat the French and British on the Western Front to win the First World War. You simply needed a stalemate on the Western Front and victory in the East. Essentially what you needed was a stalemate plus the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ended the war in Eastern Europe. Now, whether the Germans would have been able to turn military victory into long-term hegemony, it's a different matter, maybe not. The first stage of creating empire is, or even hegemony, is military victory. The second is political consolidation. Napoleon succeeded in the first, not the second. The British succeeded in the first in 1756 to 63, and then blew all their achievements by failing to consolidate, in political terms, their hold on North America. So it's difficult. But the Germans certainly had the opportunity, and it was embodied in Brest-Litovsk. Above all, what mattered was that Brest-Litovsk turned Ukraine into a notionally independent state. In practice, as an independent Ukraine in those days could only be a German satellite. The first line of my book actually is, above all else, the First World War revolved around the future of Ukraine. And I did write that in September 13, long before the present crisis started. And the reason is simple. Ukraine is roughly 70% of Russian heavy industry at that time. It is also the core of Russian export agriculture. Take out Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a great power. If Russia ceases to be a great power, then German hegemony in Europe is almost certain. Now, I'm not arguing one way or another, that it's certainly, I'm not arguing that German victory and German hegemony is the most desirable option. It isn't. There are all sorts of thoroughly unpleasant sides to it. But the alternative is not the Lord God coming down to Europe and creating peace and stability. It is the actual settlement of 1918-19. And that actual settlement was virtually bound to disintegrate. Partly because the Americans, whose power was essential to victory over Germany, go home. So the whole power political underpinning of the Versailles settlement is deeply weakened. Even more fundamentally, the Versailles settlement is made against Germany and against Russia. And you cannot have a stable European settlement against Germany and against Russia, because Germany and Russia are by far the most important countries in Europe, at least on the continent. Both Russia and Germany were revisionist powers after 1918, and that meant that the Versailles settlement was bound to disappear. In the 1930s, when Hitler emerges, Stalin faces essentially the same dilemma as Nicholas II. Do you gang up with the British and French to deter Germany, or do you try and encourage the Germans to go westwards, giving yourself a generation's breathing space? Some of the most intelligent advisors to Nicholas II had urged him to take the latter course. Stalin did take it through the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. In both cases, you could argue, the Russians made the wrong decision. Certainly in both cases, disaster occurred. But that, I think, reflects not the stupidity of the leaderships in either case, but simply that the choices were incredibly difficult to make, and of course the stakes were immense. But for the purposes of this talk, I think, and this is my final point, the real tragedy above all other great tragedies is that because Russia dropped out of the war in 17 and was not part of the victorious alliance, which won victory and created the peace settlement, the Russian people ended up by having to fight the First World War twice. And that was no fun. Thank you very much. How many minutes? Okay. Probably right.
About empires and the grand strategies that led up to the First World War. Because after all, Professor Lieven is the one who wrote the book called Empire, a comparison of the great empires through the 17th all the way up through the 20th century. So I think that's a great place to continue the conversation with the, going back 100 years to a time when people thought not in terms of nation states, but rather in terms of empires. All the leaders did. It was universal, and I think this talk has been a good reminder of that. I wonder if you could say a few words about what your perception in the origins debate, given the starting point of empire. In the origins debate, I think the idea has been kicked around from time to time that there were certain empires that were risk-taking, anti-status quo empires, willing to upset the apple cart, willing to take risks on the global stage, and others that were more conservative. And the obvious risk-taking power is Germany, and Austria, for its own reasons, seems to have taken the greatest risk of all. Britain and France would be obvious conservative, risk-taking, status quo powers willing to prevent. But the great puzzle is Russia. Where does Russia fit if you're going to divide empires into those two categories?
The point, I think, with Russia is that in the short run, to the extent that the actual rulers, the foreign minister, Nicholas II, the key advisors, can control things, they're against any risks. And they're against any risks because of their deep fear that war will bring revolution. But they're also against any risks because they think the future is on their side. And therefore they have every interest in postponing a conflict if it's got to come, or indeed not having a conflict at all. Because if there is one European power which in the longer term may really be able to match the United States, it's Russia. Simply because it has this vast population and this vast adjacent territory. And therefore, if you read people like Mendeleev, who's the great sort of Siberian, both major intellectual and scientist, but also booster, that's the line you're going to come. Given to 2000, we'll have 500 million Russians. These kind of projections. We will be the only European country which can absorb its own enormous demographic expansion within its own territory. And so the future belongs to us. And there are variations on this. But if you look at Nicholas II, he basically has the same idea. And it's not irrational in some ways. I mean, in Western Siberia, you are beginning to develop a very prosperous agriculture whose dairy exports are competing successfully with Danish exports, for instance, in the British market. So that, I think, is why Russia is a slightly difficult case. Mm-hmm. One could go on and talk about the domestic factors, but not for the moment.
Right. Well, so Professor Lieven also wrote Russia and the Origins of the First World War a long time ago, one of your first books, which remains the greatest book on the origins of the First World War, although a new book called The Russian Origins of the First World War was just published a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I think, or 4, by Sean McMeekin, who you mentioned before. And he has a very different view about Russian risk-taking, of course, that it was willing to take enormous risks in order to preemptively seize the straits and define the outcome of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So I wonder if you could, in case people have read this book, if you could either inoculate them or provide your take on that question. Exactly.
Well, I mentioned this very briefly. I mean, I think, that Russian aims vis-à-vis the Straits are a source of insecurity. And it is absolutely true that the Russians are completely determined not to let anyone else in to Constantinople and the Straits, and in many cases directly to hold them themselves. I mean, this isn't always an out-and-out aggressive policy so much as it is a sense of pessimism that the policy which has prevailed for the last 70 or 80 years, which is basically one of propping up and trying to exercise considerable influence over an Ottoman regime in decline, the sense is that this just can't go on, because the Ottoman regime is either going to disintegrate totally, as it very nearly did, of course, in the autumn of 1912, and therefore the Straits and Constantinople are going to be up for grabs, or on the contrary, it's going to become essentially, in its Turkish core, a German protectorate. And therefore, from the perspective of Sergei Sazonov, the foreign minister,
What he is really trying to do is a defensive operation, given, the point I've already made about the enormous importance of the Straits. So, I mean, I would nuance McMeekin even on that. But again, I mean, this is just to repeat myself. There's no point, and this is why so much of the sort of historiography on the origins of the First World War falls down. There's no point picking out a single power, accusing it of imperialism, and then saying it's to blame for the First World War, because this is the name of the game in those days, universally. Whether one's talking about Washington, Paris, London, Bismarck's comment about Italy, big appetite, bad teeth, is entirely right. I mean, the Italians themselves play a very significant role in starting the descent into the First World War by their attempt to grab Libya. So in that sense, I don't take McMeekin seriously. There's also he has a chapter about, the July crisis itself, and the whole business of Russian military preparations, which is frankly just wrong. That is just not. You can argue the toss with Christopher Clark's interpretation, which I think is also, as regards specifically German guilt, more wrong than right. But there it's quite subtle. I mean, undoubtedly the German leadership did make calculations in July 14. I think they were extremely risky and unwarranted. But this is something which is quite interesting, and trying to work out what is actually going on in the heads of the 3 or 4 people who really count in Germany is a very complicated one. The question of the technical military matter and McMeekin's argument about period preparatory to war is just wrong. 3 plus 2 does not equal 11 in any mathematics.
And the other book that has received enormous attention, you just mentioned, Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers. I don't know how many of you have read it here. I know I see some people who did because they were in my class. Big, thick book on the origins of World War I. And I wonder if you could give your take on, whether your view now, after all these years, after writing the Russian origins of the First World War, if your view is consonant with his or not really, in the sense that he diffuses responsibility or says that everyone in some sense, all the powers in some sense are responsible, no one a huge deal more than the others, and by the way, it's not that interesting of a question, let's explain how it broke out. But I mean, would you say that, or would you still say, I mean, I think the conclusion in your first book still says, in the end, really, Germany was the primary mover?
I mean, the first thing I'd say is I enjoyed that book. It's a good work of scholarship, and Chris is a friend, and I've got a lot of respect for him. The second thing I'd say was that, I mean, in a sense I agree with Chris, but I'd put an even stronger stress on the fact that, the war doesn't come out of nowhere. I mean, I don't believe in this idea of sleepwalkers. In my own definition of the word, I do believe that imperialism is an absolutely core cause of the First World War. I've tried to explain that. Empire, of course, not a Marxist definition of imperialism. So, I mean, in terms of saying that, the actual immediate causation is not, in the end, probably the most important or interesting element, I'm relatively sympathetic to that. I tend, you see, myself to think that if the war had been avoided in 1914, as it well might have been, if Franz Ferdinand had not been killed, there's overwhelming possibility there wouldn't have been a war in 14. There could very easily have been a war in 16 and 17. It could also have been a very different war in which the British didn't get involved initially, in which case the Germans would almost certainly have won it, for better or worse. So you've got all of that. Mm-hmm. But if you're actually looking at the July crisis, no, I don't agree with Chris. I think that in the first place, it is absolutely clear from the Austrian documents that they had been looking for a reason to squash Serbia. The paper trail is overwhelming, most recently in key meetings of the Austro-Hungarian Joint Ministerial Council in the autumn of 13. And as I say, in terms of the basic mentality of European rulers, there is a clear logic to that. I don't think that they're acting more wickedly as such than other leaders of imperial powers. After all, the Italians give a 24-hour ultimatum to the Ottoman Empire when they grab Libya, with much less excuse than the Austrians have vis-à-vis Serbia. But nevertheless, this was not sleepwalking. This was a clear clearly thought out policy. It was less sleepwalking in some ways, I think, than the British at Suez in '56. The Germans are more mixed. But, I do have great difficulties understanding how that little inner group calculated that Russia would stand aside. With the Kaiser, you always have to take into account his fits and starts. I mean, he's capable of imagining anything in a way. With Moltke, again, you can see a clear logic. I mean, in 13, even in 12, he's been arguing we should go now. A war is going to come. It's better for us it comes now. All he does in 14 is say exactly what he said in 13 and 12. Theobald Bettmann-Hollweg is a much more complicated and stranger question. In the autumn of 13, when Berchtold says, look, we're going to take out Serbia, you need to back us, Bettmann-Hollweg replies that, by any rational calculation, by any historical judgment, by any information, which is coming to us from contemporary Russia, it is virtually unbelievable that Russia will stand aside if you decide to, try to take out Serbia as an independent power factor and Austria and Russia's client. So if he was saying that and writing that in September 13, it is very hard for me to imagine that in June 1914 he really in his heart thinks that Russia's going to stand aside. You could argue that after all the Russians had backed down previously and maybe somewhere, this has an influence on him. The trouble is if you look at the statements by some of the key power holders, Yago for instance, you get some of them say Russian intervention is certain. Others say no, they might well back off. It's to the point that both the German and the Austrian ambassadors in Petersburg have been saying now for a number of years that the Russians will never back down under any circumstances if faced by a humiliation like the Bosnian crisis. So again, there is a very great degree at least of wishful thinking in Berlin. I think that one layer below Bettmann-Hollweg, Yago and co., I think they did believe Russia would step in, and they were prepared to take that risk. The bigger issue, of course, is Britain. I mean, I think of all the great powers. Actually, personally, I think that of the Austrians and the Germans bear the greatest responsibility. The British bear a very heavy responsibility, I think, far more than you get in the English language books, because the key to being a great power before 14 was to define your essential interests, make clear that definition to all, and make it equally clear that you had the force and the will, to sustain that policy. Well, nobody knew what the hell the British were up to. Nobody. They didn't know themselves. And when Moltke is asked by the Foreign Ministry in the winter of 12-13 to change his plans for war, because going through Belgium with the Schlieffen Plan will certainly bring the British in, there is a logic in his basic response that the British army is too small to matter anyway in a short war, and that in any case, if we look as if we're going to defeat France, the British will come in anyway. Because whatever they pretend, it'll be balance of power, which will bring them in. They'd let themselves open. And there is that great quote from Kiedelenwächter, Jago's predecessor, which he says to the Austrians, for God's sake, don't start a war now. This is December, 12, early 13. For God's sake, don't start a war now. The way that Anglo-German relations are going, give it another 3 years, the British will stay out. If you start a war now, the British will come in, probably. And though Germany will squash France and Russia without too much trouble, if an enemy of Britain's power comes in, then the outcome of the war is extremely debatable. And after all, Bettmann-Hollweg says the same to Berchtold. So it seems to me that actually the traditional argument that it was the British, if anyone, who had the power to deter is right.
So, I mean, the debate about the origins of the war has generated a large percent of the writings about the First World War. And in a way, it's easy to fall into a war, but the thing that I have struggled to try to understand is how and why these powers kept mobilizing and remobilizing and kept at it. Even, if you're a good gambler, you know that if you're losing, you should take your cards off the table and walk away at some point. No one was willing to do this. And yet each country kept doubling down, taking risks and
Yep.
pushing and pushing. The average weight of an Italian soldier by the end of 1917 was about 100 pounds. They were literally starving in the trenches. And yet they kept launching offensives. It's astounding to think the mobilizational power. And in the Russian case, one thing I've never really quite understood is why, after the February Revolution, the liberals come to power, why is it they decide and agree to go and launch an offensive in June 1917? We know in hindsight it was a horrible idea, and it led to the collapse of the Russian army and to the Bolshevik seizure of power in the fall. But it still remains a bit of a conundrum and a difficult thing to explain. And maybe you were getting at it when you were talking about the only context, not just for the conservative monarchs and those around them, but for everybody at the top of all of these societies was empire at the time. Liberal Milyukov comes to power and he signs off on the offensive. Any thoughts on how it is that they keep going so long?
Yes, lots of thoughts. I mean, some general, some very specific. I mean, the general one is that you have asked for such sacrifices from your people that it will be very hard to justify those sacrifices, save in terms of victory. And that operates across the board, I think. So there's that one. Then there are specific elements, and in each country it is somewhat different. I mean, it's quite interesting. I read a PhD not so very long ago, a very interesting one, which did bring out that, at the beginning of 16, there is a very significant element at the top of the Liberal government, which really, in Britain, which really is serious about a compromise peace. And that is, well, there are all sorts of fascinating conundra there, but it is actually quite interesting. Well, there are a number of things. Of course, Lloyd George, in the end, is the decisive character going the other way. But Admiral Hall, the head of British intelligence, because the British were reading all American correspondence, is systematically twisting, all these intercepts he's giving, because the Liberal leadership is hoping to ally with Colonel House and Wilson on a peace initiative. It is a classic example of an intelligence service twisting the information over which it has exclusive control, feeding it into key ministers to buttress the anti-peace line. And rather interestingly, with the active collaboration of the American ambassador in London, who, for instance, knows that the British are reading American correspondence, but doesn't tip off Washington because he's so committed to bringing America into the war. Again, it's an interesting one. I mean, the Russian case, they don't make peace essentially for the same reason they go into the war. Because they believe that if they make a separate peace with Germany, Germany will become the hegemon of Europe. I mean, in some senses, it's as simple as that. Once you get to 17 and specifically the offensive, look, I'm not an expert on this, but it's Kerensky as much as the Liberals. And there you have a kind of, Jacobin romanticism. This will be our 1793 levée en masse. And of course it goes nastily wrong. The Germans are the interesting ones, though, the really key ones, because if they'd had a more intelligent military political strategy, they would have won. Well, firstly, they wouldn't have brought the Americans in. But even having brought the Americans in, I mean, if they'd offered, if they'd been really crafty, they'd have had a plebiscite in Alsace and Lorraine, which would have kept considerable parts of both within Germany, but absolutely satisfied Wilson. They'd have handed back Belgium, probably, and they would have said, let's have self-determination in the East. Mm-hmm. Well, self-determination in the East means German hegemony. But, you've handed over power in Germany to people who have this very narrowly, the military leadership, very narrowly operational perspective, and who are also to some extent guided by the idea that only outright victory will legitimize them and their political supporters in Germany. But I would actually stress more the simple narrowness of their operational perspective.
Mm-hmm. And they had also seized control from the political folks, so it was...
Yes.
And it was
Yes,
military.
although it has to be said that a very large percentage of the majority of the Reichstag leaders support the submarine campaign to bring,
Right.
and support Ludendorff's all-or-nothing offensive in early 18. So it's not as simple as just saying that the military leadership's got loose.
Yeah. Well, let's open up the floor to questions, and you're welcome to ask about World War I or even to try to link it to contemporary affairs if you so wish. We are in the School of International Affairs. Yes.
We try.
There's just a...
Okay.
Okay.
We try to prevent war through deterrence, and deterrence has been mentioned here. But deterrence broke down, even though there was this exquisitely fine-tuned balance of power. Other considerations, you mentioned identity, played a more important role. It was more emotional, it seems to me. By our emphasis on deterrence, deterrence may work in normal times. Can deterrence work in times of stress? And I'm wondering if that's affecting the policy toward Ukraine now, because I keep hearing, well, we have to give Ukraine the arms to deter Russia. But if this is so emotional, are we misreading the importance of deterrence?
Well, I mean, firstly, let me talk about 14, then I'll come on to Ukraine. In terms of 14, it is interesting that both Moltke and the most rabid of the Russian nationalist newspapers, Novoye Vremya, both talk in the first months of 14 about the strong possibility that a European war will lead to the destruction of European civilization for 2 generations. A new 30 Years' War, they call it. There was a deterrent there. I mean, the leaderships were aware that a war between the great powers could have devastating consequences. Unfortunately, the deterrent was just not quite enough. Because, and fairly enough, the lesson of history appeared to be that war could bring something definable as victory. Again, one does have to go back, and I spent a good deal of time in this book, looking at how, above all the Russian, but more broadly European elites envisaged a future war. Bloch, for instance, in Russia, I've read both his work and also how the Russian civilian and military leadership interpreted him. And they did. I mean, they really thought about these things. There was actually had a year in the Russian archives, one of the very interesting, sets of documents in the Russian archives are from Stolypin's conference, which he set up to look precisely, this is in 1908, at the implications of a future European war for Russia. But you see, it's very simple to look backwards. The generals were entirely right in saying, firstly, that international law provided no means for the adjudication, no credible ones, for the adjudication of major conflicts. And secondly, that if you looked at the Franco-Prussian War, obviously the Prusso-Austrian War, if you looked at the Russo-Japanese War, or if you looked at the American Civil War, victory had been achieved. It had been achieved on the offensive. It had been achieved, in their opinion, because the manpower had been sufficiently imbued with patriotic commitment to take enormous casualties in the cause of victory, and that the price of victory had been considered worthwhile and was considered worthwhile by all the key, by the nations or polities which had won. If you think of the American Civil War, I mean, this is obviously the case. It is still the overwhelming view of most Americans that the price paid was worthwhile. It's complete nonsense to think that the American Civil War wasn't looked at. The head of the General Staff Academy in Russia had written his thesis on the American Civil War, and his interpretation of the American Civil War had very significant effects on the actual training of elements of the Russian army. But of course they were right. If you look at it, by far the most costly war in American history was won on the offensive. It was won in the last resort because hundreds of thousands, indeed millions, of northern young men were willing to die in the cause of American nationalism far from home. And victory was the foundation for the world in which we live. You can imagine a scenario in which the victory of the Confederacy, which would almost certainly have entailed also deep alienation of the United States and the United Kingdom would have destroyed the geopolitical alliance which is the foundation for the entire 20th century world, and are one still. So the idea that war, couldn't be won and couldn't be justified doesn't ring true pre-14, and it didn't ring true in the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 13. Again, the military interpretation, and the correct one, is that their basic presumptions were correct. The war was won very quickly. It was won on the offensive. It was won partly because Ottoman mobilization was disrupted. It was won by, as it was believed, patriotically inspired conscripts who stormed quite strong Ottoman defensive positions, manned by soldiers trained by the Germans and armed with the most up-to-date German weapons. Once again, the logic was war pays. So it's, you can understand why in 14, despite the fears that this might be a new 30 Years' War, there was another interpretation too. If you bring it on, obviously there are emotions involved, but there are always emotions involved in politics. If you're talking specifically about William II, fine. But actually the Austrian leadership is not driven by emotion. That's one where I think Chris is, takes it too far. They're not. There is a cold calculation involved of realpolitik, an incorrect one. Just because we're cold and calculating and rational, it doesn't mean that we don't come to very goofy decisions. As I'm sure, this is coming on to the second half, will be true in Ukraine. Again, the only history that all the political leaders know is 1938 in Munich. So they trot it out in all circumstances. In some ways, it's not a bad one, in terms of international law. But in other ways, they precisely failed to make, to my mind, the correct comparisons. In the first place, when Hitler took over Austria and the Sudetenland, he turned upside down the European balance of power at a time when Europe was the center of the world. The idea that Russia becomes some mighty state by taking over the East Ukrainian Rust Belt is a complete moonshine. If anyone ought to know that, my grandfather and great-grandfather owned Donetsk before the revolution. If anyone tried to give it back to me, I'd be off to New Zealand. It's all nonsense, basically. But I think, the better comparison would be end of empire. It often takes a generation for the full geopolitical consequences to come home to roost. It was 20 years after the collapse of the German and Austrian empires that the crisis really broke in Europe. It's 20 years on now. From our perspective, of course, the end of the Cold War was a sort of fairy story. Soviet Union surrenders, disintegrates, says communism was a bad idea after all, and there's virtually no bloodshed. It is, by historical standards, a complete fairy story. It was fantastic. Unfortunately, history isn't to do with fairy stories. And now, we're back in, a post-imperial crisis. I can't say much about here, but the response in Britain has been purer in many ways. And if anybody ought to know about this, it's the British. Whether it's a question of the Indian subcontinent or, for God's sake, the Middle East. We're living some of the most difficult international crises. Are the product of the British Empire and its demise. Look at Ireland, and this is a frightening one vis-à-vis Ukraine. The Northern Irish problem has to some extent, found its least bad solution after decades of conflict on the basis of constitutionally guaranteed identities, constitutionally guaranteed power sharing between communities, the right of a foreign sovereign state to have a say in Northern Irish affairs, in other words, the Republic of Ireland. But, the cost to the British Treasury has been vast in the last 30 years. Northern Ireland is a very small place, and the British were quite clearly responsible for it. Nobody's responsible for Ukraine, and we're heading in the direction of having two vast failed states. The main difference being that the Russians will probably pay for their failed state, and we won't pay for ours. That's how I see it, But, I have my own particular perspective on affairs. But we're going to blow it, that's for certain. Absolutely.
Yes. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. James Siebens. I'm a master's student here at SIS. So sticking with the theme of Ukraine and Russia's decision making. I've argued that Russia is actually acting out of fear rather than revanchism or aggression, and that it's similarly to its designs on Constantinople, it may be sort of on an operational offensive, but on a strategic defensive. In other words, unwilling to surrender territory or interests that it thinks are essential to its national prosperity. Would you agree with that analysis, or what would you say in terms of Russia's driving motives?
The first thing I'd say is that I'm an expert on Tsarist Russia. You know, my opinions on the subject of Mr. Putin need to be taken with a strong pinch of salt. You know, ask my brother; he knows more than I do. Look, I think there is undoubtedly a calculation going on in Putin's mind now about the prestige he's getting within Russia out of this. And I think there are undoubtedly revanchist elements, you know, within the Russian leadership, and I think he himself is probably at times tickling himself with the idea that, you know, the Russian bear is at last growling and people are paying some attention. But I have no doubt, too, that there is a defensive element. They always made it clear that they didn't like, you know, the expansion of NATO and the EU eastwards, and they resented it in all sorts of ways, and they saw elements of it as a security threat, much exaggerated, but that Ukraine was the sticking point. And the basic reality is that they care a great deal more about Ukraine than we do, and are certainly prepared to go a lot further in securing their interests there, because those interests matter much more. I'll give you one little example. I mean, you know, Ukrainians can work anywhere in Russia, you know, which is a major concession. You try and give Ukrainians the right to, you know, work anywhere in the European Union, and you'll have a Maidan on the streets of Birmingham in England. The English are hysterical about the, you know, Bulgarian plumbers and Romanian God knows what, you know, for all sorts of reasons linked into the fact that this is something they can attack, whereas the resentments about, you know, Pakistani immigration for all sorts of reasons, a much greater threat, of course, cannot be politically expressed openly. And nor can it easily be expressed all the resentments against globalization and the genuinely quite unpleasant things it's done to large sections of the English working class and even, you know, core middle class. Well, if they're in a state of hysteria about, you know, the Bulgarians and the Romanians, as I say, you know, the idea that they're going to match the Russians in allowing Ukrainians to work in the European Union is a joke. So that is a sort of reflection of the fact, you know, that the Russians will always pay the bigger price because it matters much more to them. I mean, the thing is, again, I mean, to go back to where I was at, you know, when I was talking, I mean, the Ukrainian issue is much more important in pre-1914 politics and in Russo-Austrian relations than is normally understood. It's not yet the key issue. But whether, you know, if you're talking about some of the key public intellectuals and thinkers about international relations, Menshikov on the right or Struve on the left, well, the center, they're obsessed with Ukraine. And they see the Ukrainian issue as much more important than the Balkans. Menshikov's not interested in Slavs and Balkans or anything else. And he's terrified of a future war. But he's prepared to fight Austria and thinks fighting Austria is inevitable because of the Ukrainian issue. And you can understand why. You know, Ukrainian nationalism is now just coming over the horizon in a serious way in Russia. And whether there is a debate, not just, you know, in Petersburg and Moscow or in Vienna, but within Russian Ukraine, within the Ukrainian elites and intelligentsia, as to whether Ukraine is the most Russian of provinces, cradle of the Russian state and of orthodoxy, as, you know, a significant element of the ethnic Ukrainian elite argues, or whether, on the contrary, it is a separate, you know, ethno-nation of its own. And that is hugely complicated for the Russians by the fact that 25% of ethnic Ukrainians live in Austria or Hungary. And, you know, Berchtold himself, the Austrian foreign minister in 1912, summer 1912, says to the Joint Ministerial Council, look, there are two issues which make a real Russo-Austrian rapprochement impossible. The obvious one that you understand, he's talking to his fellow ministers, is Russia's patronage of the Slavs in the Balkans, and specifically Serbia. But coming up roaring behind that is the Ukrainian issue. I fully understand, he says, that, we are a state which has allowed our various nations to develop their separate consciousness, etc., etc. And obviously, we can't exclude the Ukrainians, whom he called Ruthenians, from that. But have no illusions. For Russia, this is a life and death issue. And of course it was. If Ukrainians were the most Russian of Russians, as the origins of Russian statehood, Russian orthodoxy, where the dynasty came from, but also where the fighting line with Poles traditionally, if Ukrainians are the most Russian of Russians, then Russia is essentially a national empire. 67% of the population are in inverted commas Russian. Well, you discount all the small peoples, as everybody did in those days. They can't stand on their own. You discount all these backward Muslims. And you reckon that, you've got to stump on the Poles once a generation. That's just part of being an empire. And you're okay. But of course, if the Ukrainians are a separate nation, then the Russian Empire begins to look like the much despised Austrian and Ottoman empires. And that is something that no member of the Russian elite will accept. And that goes out to the cadets, Milyukov and co. And they won't accept it both because of its geopolitical implications and because it completely undermines their own sense of Russian identity. These were really serious issues then. They're not now, actually. But Western politicians may turn them that way. And so may Mr. Putin. Oh, for God's sake, I'm not, I'm not saying the fault is all on this side by any stretch of the imagination.
Yes, Stephen. Go ahead, Stephen. Oh, sorry.
Steve Williams, you've alluded really several times to the tension between nationalism and empire, and I wonder if you could ruminate on that further. Does nationalism in effect preclude a successful empire, or perhaps the reverse, or is there a way of weaving them together that works? You've thought a great deal more about this than most people.
Well, I could talk an awful lot about this. Perhaps you'd forgive me for telling you a story for a start. I was in Indonesia with my wife, and she was on business, and I was trying to get my knee mended. And the poor Indonesian physiotherapist was trying to mend my knee while I was interrogating her about identities in Indonesia. And she was from Java. Her mother was also from a different bit of Java, but spoke a completely mutually incomprehensible dialect. More interestingly, her children were at school in Jakarta, the capital. And in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, it's not just that all teaching is in Bahasa, the entirely artificial modern language. It's also the case that you can't even be taught Javanese in a government school in the capital. And my mind went back to Austria, which was actually, I think, the most civilized in many ways of the great empires before 14. And the idea that in Vienna, not merely would all teaching be in Esperanto, but you couldn't be taught anything about the German language, history, or culture. And although that may seem, that is an insight. It's one way I come into this. Look, frankly, I'm an enemy of 1789. I think it was a catastrophe. I think the whole idea of popular sovereignty has enormous dangers because you immediately begin asking who the people are. And that is a very complicated matter in multi-ethnic communities. And as I said before, if the great states of Asia catch 1789 disease, God help us all. Because although the French, of course, claimed that they were creating civic nationalism, it seems to me that actually that was only because they took the ethnic nation underlying, France for granted. And the export of West European origin nationalism, firstly to Eastern Europe and then to the broader world, has horrendous potential consequences. It's much safer in federal systems because there you can actually accept popular sovereignty as an idea, but also accept that there are fundamentally different peoples. There you can nuance things. You can have upper houses represent all these kind of things. But the straight doctrine of ethnic nationalism, I think, is look again. We get drawn back to Ukraine. But it seems to me that the Ukraine which was created in 1991 could only survive if it was accepted that there was more than one Ukrainian people. And that's not easy. Certainly not easy within the European and specifically Central and East European tradition of ethnic nationalism. The great empires, of course, if one goes back, were not usually national empires, not in the sense that we mean them. It's one of the great things about even most of the Chinese dynastic empires, but certainly the great Islamic empires, the Ottomans. Certainly true of the Roman Empire, that these were essentially not nations, certainly not nations ethnically defined in control. Now, admittedly, that is in part sometimes because these were aristocratic empires in which the ruling elites were united by class and the metropolitan plebs was even more brutally exploited than the peripheral plebs for all sorts of reasons. But they also did have some kind of greater unity through a great high culture. I'd say two things in terms of the contemporary spin-off of that. I was once out in entirely amateur fashion out in rural southwest China. It was fascinating. Driving through villages, I've forgotten which minority it was, in which you could actually see a process going on underneath your nose of these various tribal peoples acquiring a mass Chinese identity without necessarily losing their own local one. And that to me was as if the Roman Empire had survived in Western Europe into the era of the modern state and modern educational systems, and fundamentally a Roman identity was being inculcated through schools everywhere from Scotland to Romania. And I suspect we'd live in a better world had that been the case. I think one of the strengths of the United States is that, this is a community rooted in ideology, that the common bind is ideology, not identity. Now, here am I turning up in your country. But I mean, it seems to me that that is one of the strengths. The fact that, of course, with a great deal of difficulty, the community is evolving still from being what was in its origin, of course, an ethno-ideological identity, into one which is, to a much greater degree open to all, is a very significant factor in American power and attractiveness, but of course has very difficult, domestic consequences, particularly in the era of mass consciousness and democracy. The whole thing about old empires, the old great land empires, was that essentially they were federations of aristocracies. The aristocracies then managed their own people through patron-client relations. You're in a different world nowadays trying to make empire work.
The full answer to this question, I will note, is in the book on empires that Dominic. It's a wonderful tour de force that, as in the answer to this question, goes comparatively back and forth all over the globe. Was there another question? Yes, sir.
Hi there, my name's Tyler. I'm a junior here at American. Just to go back to the war a little bit more, you mentioned in passing early on in the talk that what was needed to win the war was a stalemate in the West and victory in the East, or a Brest-Litovsk-style settlement. I'm sure that von Moltke the Younger and the Westerners would disagree with you on that point, but it seems to me that historians recently have often made the case that, as you did, the future belonged to Russia.
Just better.
Oh. Yes? Haha! It seems that the future belonged to Russia in 1914, so therefore from Germany's perspective, the number one enemy should have been Russia. From that perspective, what would you say to the historical process that ended up in von Moltke's famous roll of the iron dice to attack France rather than Russia, if Russia was truly the enemy that needed knocking out?
Look, I think again you get back to the narrowly operational perspectives of the German military leadership, even at its best. In a curious kind of way, they're much, and actually to some extent the European military leaderships as a whole, by being more professional, are also less effective than they had been a century before. Because the old aristocratic military leadership at its best was a political leadership. It had a much broader and less narrowly professional understanding. I mean, the obvious point to make is that if the Germans had stood on the defensive on the Western Front and let the French bash themselves, to death against that defensive, it would have been virtually impossible to bring the United Kingdom into the war. And that if the Germans had concentrated their efforts in the east, the Russian Revolution would probably have come earlier. Of course, the German perspective in 1914 is that you can't defeat Russia militarily. And that in itself, narrowly, is right. To my mind, the Germans actually come closer in the First World War than they do in the Second to creating hegemony in Europe, a German hegemony in Europe, and they come closer than Napoleon. And that is because fundamentally European geopolitics makes it possible but difficult to control what I would call the Carolingian core of Europe, Charlemagne's old empire and the founder states of the EU. But you then have got these two big power centres on the periphery. Taking out the British and the Russians is a difficult task on the basis of the geopolitical resources of the Carolingian core. Not least because you need different types of power. Naval, across the channel against the English, military, logistical, against the Russians to take you beyond the Polish, Belarusian swamp and plain. Difficult, but possible. The key is, though, that against Russia you need a joint military political strategy. And the Germans came closer to that in the First War, to some extent by accident, than either Napoleon or Hitler. That's how we fought the Cold War, after all, at a certain level of generalization, military political or political military. Again, these things, of course, are easier said now than understood beforehand. It's not as if there was no awareness of the possibility of revolution in Russia if Russia went to war. That is one of the calculations, which is going on in Berlin and Vienna, and certainly some people do think this will be a major deterrent. Again, it's not for me, and it's very difficult to say in retrospect. In the end, one's dealing with a tiny, tiny group of decision makers. And it's particularly Bettmann Hollweg. You have to. I used to know his granddaughter, and talking to her was interesting. I mean, he was the only break once the Kaiser got excited, and given the fact the military was going to say, let's go. So at a certain extent, it actually boils down to working out, what was going on in his mind. And there one does sometimes get back to the strictly biographical. He was clearly a man inclined to pessimism who was in a mood of deep pessimism in the summer of 14, not least because his wife had died relatively recently. These things may seem trivial, but they really matter as regards individuals. So it's a difficult one, but by the time they'd fought the war for 2.5 years and there'd been no Russian Revolution, fairly enough, they had to some extent given up on the hope of it. And as tends to happen in life, unexpected, boom. I mean, it wasn't actually as if of course the Allies weren't expecting a revolution. And actually, I think most of the Russian political elite thinks there's going to be a revolution after the war, but probably not in it. Mm-hmm. It's complicated, but it was clearly a huge and decisive miscalculation, because I think if they hadn't brought the Americans in and the Russian Revolution had clearly begun to take Russia out, then I don't think even Ludendorff and Hindenburg could have blown it. Because they didn't need to defeat the Western Allies. Also, look, if the Americans don't come in, the Allies have no chance of victory over Germany. You've got the financial crisis coming on, even in London in late 16. You've got the mutinies of the French army in 17. Without Russia and without the United States, they are going to have no alternative but to make a compromise peace. And actually, I think, the idea of, have you ever come across Soutou? It's a very fine book, Law et Leçon. I think the United States and, in time, the British and French would actually have reconciled themselves to a Germany which was exercising hegemony in Eastern Europe. After all, that was the logic of 1938 too. They would have had no alternative, probably, but they would have accepted it.
Wow. Well, on this note. So we have come to an end, but 3 quick things. One, I don't think we mentioned the title and release date of your forthcoming book upon which this was all based.
Well, unfortunately, my British editor went on sabbatical for 4 months. So when exactly the British edition is coming out is unclear. I think it'll probably be out at the end of May or the beginning of June. The title of the British version is Towards the Flame, Empire, War and the End of Tsarist Russia. I think almost uniquely the French edition will be out before the initial British one. It comes out at the beginning of May, and I've forgotten what its title is. Even the Dutch may get in before the British.
Wow.
The American edition will come out in August, and it's called what is it? It's called The Road to...
By Dominic Levin.
It's
Find
me,
it by Dominic
and
Levin.
it's called
So-
The End of Tsarist Russia, Russia's Road to War and Revolution.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the second thing is we have a reception outside, I believe. All are welcome. And the third thing is let's thank our speaker.